Hello. Welcome to Mysterious Sleep Stories, your sanctuary between sleep and wakefulness, filled with mystical tales. Tonight, we're back on a journey, a voyage into the depths of the strange, the inexplicable, and the beautifully mysterious. Whether you're lying in bed after a long day, seeking a quiet moment in the evening, or looking for a break from the noise of modern life, you're in the right place. Tonight, we return to a time when the world balanced on the centuries, when horse-drawn carriages still roared along the cobblestones, when electric lights were just beginning to illuminate the streets, and when the certainties of the old world gave way to the mysteries of the new. We traveled to Vienna in 1901, a city where coffee and conversation flowed as freely as the Danube, where artists and scientists, philosophers and dreamers gathered in smoky cafes to discuss the nature of reality. Tonight's story is about something that should be simple, something we take for granted every day. But in the hands of a mysterious craftsman, it became a gateway to questions that still baffle us today. This is the story of a clock, but no ordinary clock. This was a clock that counted backward, moving against the flow of time, and in doing so, challenging everything its observers thought they knew about the past, present, and future. So sit back, relax, and let your mind journey back in time to a workshop illuminated by gas lamps in the heart of Imperial Vienna, where the impossible became very, very real. Chapter 1. The Watchmaker's Workshop. In the autumn of 1901, on a narrow street in Vienna's historic and Neustadt district, there was a watchmaker's shop that few noticed or visited, and even fewer clearly remembered. The workshop was on the ground floor of a building that had stood since the 7th century, its facade weathered by more than 200 winters, its windows covered in thick glass that transformed the outside world into shimmering works of art. The shop had no prominent sign, only a small certificate plaque by the door that read J. Hartmann, Uhrmacher, Watchmaker. If you peeked inside through those noisy windows, you could see what was inside. The walls were filled with clocks of all kinds, their pendulums swinging in a silent symphony, their dials gleaming warmly in the heat of oil lamps. The shop was filled with the strange smell of metal shavings and linseed oil, old wood and antique wrapping, as if it were breathing its essence, a distinctive smell, captured in time. Johann Hartmann was not a famous watchmaker. His name did not appear in prestigious registers, and unlike his more ambitious contemporaries, he never sought the patronage of the imperial court. In his 60s, he was a man with silver tassels visible on his lapel and hands bearing the long-term precision of a master craftsman. His fingers bore the subtle marks of professionalism, small burns from wear and tear, fine white lines where delicate instruments had glided, countless bows, and calluses from holding his teeth. Those who did business with Hartmann found him a pleasant but distant man, somewhat out of sync with the world around him. He greeted his clients politely, discussed their needs professionally, but there was always something in his pale blue eyes that suggested his mind was elsewhere, perhaps preoccupied with the kind of problems most people never considered. In 1901, Vienna was a city of extraordinary alienation. For over 50 years, it had been the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the home of Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled a vast region stretching from the Alps to the Carpathians, from Bohemia to the Adriatic. The city itself had undergone a transformation in recent years. The old city walls had been demolished and replaced by the magnificent Ringstrasse, housing every conceivable historical building. Neo-Gothic churches, Renaissance revival museums, Baroque palaces. All newly constructed but designed to look timelessly old. But beneath this dominance, the city teemed with modern energy and intellectual dynamism. Electric trams now ran alongside their carriages. The telephone was becoming widespread. The first automobiles were beginning to appear on the streets, frightening horses and delighting crowds. And in the coffee houses, a particularly Viennese institution, the air was filled not only with tobacco smoke, but also with revolutionary ideas. This was the Vienna of Gustav Klimt, whose gold-colored paintings both caused scandal and captivated the art world. This was the Vienna of Gustav Mahler, who ran the Imperial Opera and struggled to make ends meet. This was Vienna, the homeland of writers Arthur Schnitzler and Hugo von Hofmannsthal, who explored the hidden depths of human psychology with unparalleled courage. And this was Vienna, the homeland of Sigmund Freud, a young doctor who had recently published a strange and unusual book, The Interpretation of Dreams. In this book, Freud argued that the unconscious exists in a realm where its own logic is observed. Other options flow differently, and the past and present merge beneath the thoughts of others. This transition and transformation was facilitated by Johann Hartmann through his questioning of the very conception of temporal reality. It all began in September, as the summer heat gave way to the cool autumn air. A customer came to Hartmann's shop with a seemingly ordinary request. The man was clearly wealthy. His coat was fine wool, his watch chain was gold, and his demeanor was that of someone accustomed to having his wishes fulfilled. He explained that he wanted a clock for his study, but not just any ordinary clock. He wanted something unique, something that would be the subject of conversation, something that would set his collection apart. "I want a clock that runs backward," he said to Hartmann. The clockmaker looked at him for a long time, his pale eyes unreadable. "You see," he said, "things like that don't show the correct time." The customer brushed off this concern. "I have other clocks for that. This one will be purely decorative. A matter of curiosity. Is it possible?" Hartmann thought for a moment. "It's possible," he said finally. "The mechanism will need to be changed, but it can be done. But I have to ask, is that really what you want? A clock that moves against the natural flow might be unsettling." The customer laughed. "My dear man, that is precisely the point. I want my guest to be unsettled, to think, to question. That is the mark of good art, is it not?" Hartmann agreed to take the commission. The price was settled, half to be paid in advance, the remainder upon delivery. The customer left, satisfied, and Hartmann returned to his workshop in the back of the shop, where his true work was done. The workshop was a small room crowded with the tools and materials of his trade. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with vices and files, tiny hammers and precision screwdrivers, coils of spring steel, and boxes of brass screws, so small they seemed almost invisible. A lathe stood in one corner, its foot pedal worn smooth by decades of use. Oil lamps hung from the ceiling, and a small stove provided warmth in the winter months. Hartmann sat at his primary workbench and pulled a clean sheet of paper towards him. He dipped his pen and began to sketch the mechanism he would need to create. To make a clock run backwards required more than simply reversing the gears. The entire escape mechanism, the heart of the clock that translated the steady unwinding of a spring or the descent of weights into the regulated ticking that marks seconds and minutes, would need to be redesigned. As he worked on the design, something strange began to happen. Hartmann found his thoughts drifting in unexpected directions. He began to think not just about the mechanism of making a clock run backwards, but about what it would mean if time itself could run backwards. What would the world look like? Would effects precede their causes? Would people grow younger instead of older? Would the dead rise from their graves and walk backwards through their lives until they were unborn themselves back into nothingness? These thoughts troubled him, but they also fascinated him. He had always been interested in the nature of time. As a clockmaker, he spent his days measuring it, dividing it into units, marking its passage. But what was time, really? Was it merely the movement of gears and the swing of pendulums? Or was it something deeper, something more fundamental? He remembered a discussion he had overheard in the Café Central a few weeks earlier. A group of university students had been debating philosophy, as students often did in Vienna's coffeehouses, and one of them had mentioned a German philosopher named Hegel. This philosopher, the student explained, had argued that time was not a simple straight line from past to future, but something more complex, something that involved a kind of circular motion, a process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Could time move in circles? Could the future somehow influence the past, just as the past clearly influenced the future? These were not the kinds of questions a clockmaker normally concerned himself with, but Hartmann found he could not put them aside. He worked on the backwards clock through September and into October. The mechanism proved more challenging than he had anticipated. It was not enough to simply reverse the direction of the gears. Doing so created problems with the escapement that made the clock run irregularly. He had to completely redesign the entire inner workings, creating something that had never existed before. As he worked, he made careful notes, filling page after page with diagrams and calculations. But mixed in with these technical drawings were other notes, philosophical speculation about the nature of time. He wrote about entropy, the tendency of all systems to move from order to disorder. Could entropy be reversed? Could a broken egg spontaneously reassemble itself? Could smoke flow back down into an extinguished candle and reignite the flame? The clock took shape slowly. Hartmann crafted each gear by hand, filing and polishing until they fit together with microscopic precision. He fashioned a brass case in a style that would have been fashionable 50 years earlier, with ornate decoration and a glass face that revealed the mechanism within. The clock face itself he painted in reverse, with the numbers running counterclockwise from 12. At the top, where 12 should be, he placed the number 12, but then, moving to the left instead of right, came 11, then 10, and so on around the dial. By late October, the clock was finished. Hartmann wound it carefully and set it running. The second hand moved smoothly, but leftward instead of rightward. The minute hand followed, and after 12 minutes, the hour hand had visibly shifted, also moving leftward around the dial. It worked perfectly, and yet, watching it, Hartmann felt a profound unease. There was something disturbing about seeing time move backward, even if it was only an artifice, a mechanical trick. It seemed to violate some fundamental order of the universe. He notified his customer that the clock was ready for delivery. The wealthy man arrived the next day, examined the clock with delight, paid the remainder of what he owed, and arranged for the hour to be delivered to his home that afternoon. Hartmann should have forgotten about the commission at that point, should have moved on to other work. But he found he could not stop thinking about what he had created. That evening, after closing the shop, he sat in his workshop for a long time, staring at his notes and drawings. What if, he wondered, it was possible to create not just a clock that ran backward, but a clock that actually moved backward in time? Not merely showing reverse numbers on a dial, but genuinely undoing the passage of temporal duration? The idea seemed absurd, impossible. I swear, he began to sketch a new design. This one will be different. It would not simply reverse the visible movement of the hands. It would somehow engage with time itself at a deeper level. He was not sure how this could be accomplished, but he felt compelled to try. Through November and December, Hartmann worked on this new project in secret, telling no one. He purchased special components, rare metals and crystals that he had never used before. He studied obscure texts on horology and even ventured into areas of natural philosophy that bordered on the occult. The new clock began to take shape, but it was unlike anything Hartmann had ever made before. The mechanism was extraordinarily complex, with layers upon layers of gearing, and at its heart was a peculiar arrangement of crystals and metal that Hartmann had designed based on principles he did not fully understand. As 1901 drew to a close and 1902 approached, Vienna was in a festive mood. The Christmas markets filled the streets with the smell of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine. Snow fell softly on the city's domes and spires. In the grand houses, balls were held, and in the modest apartments, families gathered for simple celebrations. Hartmann barely noticed. He was consumed by his work on the clock. On New Year's Eve, as church bells rang throughout the city to mark the arrival of 1902, he was in his workshop making final adjustments to the mechanism. At last, in the early hours of New Year's Day, he wound the clock and set it running. For a moment, nothing unusual happened. The clock ticked steadily, its hands moving backward around the dial, just as the earlier clock had done. But then Hartmann noticed something strange. The oil lamp on his workbench flickered, and its flame seemed to bend in an impossible direction. The shadows in the workshop moved in ways that made no sense, and Hartmann felt a sensation he had never experienced before, a kind of vertigo, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly become unstable. He looked at the clock more closely. The hands were moving, yes, but they were moving in a way that seemed to pull at his perception. It was as if they were not just indicating time running backward, but actually causing it to do so, at least in some small sphere around the clock itself. Hartmann watched, mesmerized and horrified, as a pen on his workbench rolled slightly, then rolled back to where it had started. A curl of smoke from his pipe reversed its direction, flowing back down toward the tobacco. And in the mirror on the wall, his own reflection seemed to move just slightly out of sync with his movements, as if there was a tiny delay or perhaps a tiny advancement. The sensation lasted only a moment. Then, with a sound like a sharp intake of breath, the clock stopped. Its hands froze, and the strange effects ceased immediately. Everything returned to normal, or appeared to. Hartmann sat down heavily, his heart pounding. What had he done? Had he truly created something that could affect time itself, even if only minutely, only briefly? Or had he simply experienced a momentary delusion, a product of too many hours of work and too little sleep? He examined the clock carefully. The mechanism was not broken. It had simply stopped, as if it had exhausted some reservoir of energy or something else. Something that had no name because it had never been identified before. Hartmann realized he was out of his depth. What he had created, whether real or imagined, was beyond his ability to fully understand or control. He needed help, but whom he could turn to? Who would believe him? Who wouldn't think he was mad? He thought of the coffeehouses, of the intellectuals who gathered there. Vienna in 1902 was home to some of the greatest minds in Europe. Perhaps one of them could make sense of what he had created. Perhaps one of them could explain what he had witnessed. But first, he needed to rest. He needed to think. He carefully wrapped the clock in cloth and placed it in a locked cabinet in his workshop. Then he extinguished the lamps and went upstairs to his small apartment above the shop. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, Hartmann dreamed of clocks. Countless clocks, all running backward, their hands spinning wildly in reverse while around them the world rewound itself like a cinema reel played in the wrong direction. People walked backward through the streets of Vienna, growing younger with each step. Buildings unconstructed themselves, returning to piles of stone and timber. The great Ringstrasse disappeared, and the old city walls rose up again from their foundations. And through all of this, Hartmann heard the sound of ticking, steady and implacable, measuring out the seconds as they flowed backward into the past. He woke up before dawn, disturbed and uneasy. The clock waited for him in the workshop below, and in the days that followed, its presence would begin to ripple outward through Vienna, touching the lives of people who would never know its origins, but who would never quite forget the strange effects it produced. The story of the clock that counted backwards had only just begun. Part 2. The Nature of Time. To understand what happened next, we must step back and consider the question that lay at the heart of Johann Hartmann's creation. What is time? It seems like such a simple question. We all experience time. We watch it pass, feel ourselves aging, see the seasons change. We measure it with clocks and calendars, mark it in seconds and minutes, hours and days, years and centuries. Time is so fundamental to our experience that we rarely stop to question what it actually is. But those who thought deeply about such matters in Vienna in 1902 knew that time was far from simple. It was, in fact, one of the greatest mysteries facing both philosophy and science. In the coffeehouses of Vienna, where intellectual discourse flourished like nowhere else in the world, the nature of time was a frequent topic of discussion. In the Café Central on Herrengasse, with its vaulted ceilings and marble columns, professors from the university would sit for hours nursing their coffee, debating whether time was objective or subjective, whether it existed independent of human consciousness or was merely a product of how our minds organize experience. The Café Greenstidel, before it was demolished in 1897, had been another hub of such discussions. The writer Peter Altenburg, who actually gave the Café Central as his official address and had his mail delivered there, was famous for his philosophical musings, many of which touched on the nature of perception and reality. Hugo von Hofmannsthal, the young literary prodigy, frequented these establishments, as did Arthur Schnitzler, the playwright and physician whose works explored the fluidity of time and memory. But it was not just writers and philosophers who pondered these questions. Scientists, too, were beginning to realize that time was far stranger than it appeared. In 1902, a young man named Albert Einstein was working as a clerk in the Swiss Patent Office in Bern, and he was thinking deeply about time. Within a few years, he would publish papers that would revolutionize physics, showing that time was not absolute and universal as Newton had thought, but relative, flowing at different rates depending on motion and gravity. But even in 1902, the seeds of these ideas were germinating in minds across Europe. Physicists had discovered that the laws of nature seemed to have a curious property. They work the same whether you run time forward or backward. If you filmed a pool ball bouncing off a cushion and played the film in reverse, you could not tell which direction was real and which was reversed. The mathematics describing the collision would work equally well in either temporal direction. And yet, we never see time actually run backward in our everyday experience. Eggs break, but never spontaneously reassemble. People age, but never grow younger. Why? This puzzle had led to the development of the concept of entropy, the tendency of closed systems to move from states of order to states of disorder. An intact egg represents a highly ordered state. A broken egg represents a more disordered state. The laws of probability make it overwhelmingly likely that systems will move from order to disorder, but not impossible that they could move the other way. So, in principle, there was no absolute law of physics that forbade time from running backward. It was just extraordinarily unlikely. But extraordinarily unlikely is not the same as impossible. These were the kinds of ideas circulating in Vienna's intellectual circles when word of Hartmann's clock began to spread. The first person outside Hartmann's shop to learn of the clock's unusual properties was a young physicist named Dr. Ernst Braun. Braun was a lecturer at the University of Vienna, working in the field of thermodynamics, and he was known for his interest in unusual phenomena. He frequented the Cafe Museum on Karlsplatz, a recently opened establishment whose starkly modern interior, designed by Adolf Loos, was the subject of much controversy. Loos was an architect who rejected ornamentation, arguing that decoration was a crime in modern times. His cafe interior was stripped of the usual elaborate decorations found in Viennese establishments, featuring instead clean lines and functional design. It was the perfect setting for discussions of modern science and progressive ideas. One evening in mid-January 1902, Braun was sitting in the Cafe Museum with several colleagues when a mutual acquaintance mentioned the strange clock. The man, a minor official in the city bureaucracy, had heard about it from the wealthy customer who had commissioned the first backwards clock from Hartmann. He says the clockmaker has created something even more remarkable, the official explained. Not just a clock that shows time running backward, but one that apparently affects time itself in some way. Braun was immediately intrigued. What do you mean, affects time itself? The official shrugged. I don't know the details. But apparently there were strange occurrences when a clock was tested. Objects moving oddly. Visual distortions. The clockmaker is said to be quite disturbed by what he created. I should like to meet this clockmaker, Braun said. Do you know where his shop is located? The official provided the address, and the next day, Braun made his way to the narrow street in the Innenstadt where Hartmann's shop stood. He entered to the sound of a small bell above the door, and found himself surrounded by the gentle ticking of dozens of clocks. Hartmann emerged from the back room. Good morning. How may I help you? Braun introduced himself and explained his interest. I have heard that you have created a most unusual timepiece. I am a physicist, and such things are of great interest to me scientifically. I wonder if you might allow me to examine this clock. Hartmann studied the young scientist for a long moment. He saw an earnest face, intelligent eyes, an air of genuine scholarly curiosity rather than sensationalism. He made a decision. Come with me, he said. He led Braun into the workshop. The room was as Hartmann had left it that New Year's morning. Workbenches crowded with tools, the oil lamps, the small stove now burning to ward off January's chill. Hartmann went to the locked cabinet and removed the cloth-wrapped bundle. He sat on the workbench and carefully unwrapped it. The clock was beautiful, Braun thought. The brass case gleamed in the lamplight, and through the glass face, he could see the intricate mechanism within. The numbers on the face ran counterclockwise, and the hands pointed to what would be understood as 3:15, though of course if the clock was running backward, this meant nothing. It isn't running at the moment, Hartmann said. I have not wound it since New Year's Day. What happened on New Year's Day? Braun asked. Hartmann hesitated, then told him. He described the strange effects he had witnessed, the distortions, the sense that reality itself was bending around the clock. He expected skepticism, perhaps even laughter. But Braun listened with intense attention, occasionally asking questions, but never interrupting the flow of the narrative. When Hartmann finished, Braun was silent for a moment. Then he said, May I win the clock? Hartmann felt a flash of fear. I'm not certain that's wise. I understand your concern, Braun said. But as a scientist, I must observe phenomena if I am to understand them. I promise I will be careful. Reluctantly, Hartmann agreed. He showed Braun the winding mechanism, a key that fit into the back of the clock. Braun took the key and slowly, carefully wound the mainspring. The mechanism clicked softly as he turned the key. When the spring was fully wound, he removed the key and waited. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the clock began to tick. The hand started to move backward around the dial. Both men watched intently. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an ordinary backwards clock. But then Braun noticed a strange quality to the air around the timepiece, a kind of shimmer or distortion, like heat waves rising from hot pavement on a summer day, but denser, more pronounced. A pencil on the workbench rolled slightly. It paused and rolled back. Braun blinked, and for just an instant, he could have sworn he saw his own hand in two positions at once, as if there was a ghost image of it just slightly displaced in time. The sensation lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Then, as before, the clock stopped with that peculiar sound like an indrawn breath, and the effect ceased. Braun stood very still, his scientific mind racing. "May I try that again?" he asked. They repeated the experiment 3 more times that afternoon, and each time the results were the same. The clock would run for a brief period, strange effects would manifest in its vicinity, and then it would stop. Braun made careful notes, measuring as best he could the duration of the effects, the radius of the area in which they occurred, the types of phenomena observed. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "I have no immediate explanation for what we're witnessing, but I would very much like to bring some colleagues to examine this. Would you permit that?" Hartmann agreed, though with considerable reluctance. He had created something he did not fully understand, something that frightened him, and now was being examined by scientists who might want to take it apart, study it, perhaps even claim it as their own discovery. Over the next several weeks, a small group of physicists and engineers from the University of Vienna made their way to Hartmann's shop. They conducted experiments with the clock, trying to understand its properties. They discovered several interesting things. The effect was definitely localized. It extended about 2 meters from the clock in all directions, creating a sphere of temporal distortion. Outside this sphere, time flowed normally. The duration of the effect varied slightly with each winding, but averaged between 10 and 20 seconds before the clock stopped itself. Objects within the affected area did appear to move backward, but only very slightly, and only for objects that were already in motion. A rolling ball would reverse its direction. A drop coin would appear to hesitate in midair for a fraction of a second before continuing its fall. Most bizarrely, observers within the sphere reported strange perceptual effects. Some saw brief after-images or pre-images of movement. Others reported feeling as if they had just experienced something they couldn't quite remember, a sensation that Sigmund Freud, when he later learned of it, would find deeply fascinating. The scientists could find no conventional explanation. The clock's mechanism, while unusual, was entirely mechanical. There was nothing that should produce these effects. Some began to speculate that perhaps Hartmann had accidentally discovered a way to manipulate some previously unknown property of space-time itself. Word of the experiments spread through Vienna's scientific community, and from there into the broader intellectual circles. The clock became a topic of fascination and debate in the coffeehouses. Some dismissed it as a hoax or mass delusion. Others saw it as proof that reality was far stranger than conventional science acknowledged. Among those who heard of the clock was Dr. Sigmund Freud. Freud in 1902 was not yet the world-famous figure he would become. His book, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900, had sold poorly, only 350 copies in its first 2 years. But among a small circle of psychologists and psychiatrists in Vienna, it had created intense interest and controversy. Freud was developing a radical new approach to understanding the human mind, one that emphasized the role of the unconscious, of repressed memories and desires, of the way past experiences shape present behavior. Time played a crucial role in Freud's theories. He believed that psychological problems in adulthood often stem from experiences in childhood, sometimes experiences that have been forgotten or repressed. Through psychoanalysis, the talking cure he was developing, Freud hoped to help patients travel backward through time in their minds, recovering lost memories and understanding how their past had shaped their present. So when Freud heard about a clock that literally made time run backward, even if only in a limited way, he was immediately intrigued. The idea resonated with his work in ways he could hardly articulate. If time could be reversed mechanically, what might that suggest about the possibility of reversing psychological time, of genuinely undoing or rewriting traumatic experiences? In late February 1902, Freud visited Hartmann's shop. The clockmaker, by now somewhat weary of the attention his creation had attracted, nevertheless greeted Freud politely. He had heard of the doctor's controversial theories, and he sensed in Freud a kindred spirit, another man who had ventured into territory that conventional wisdom said was forbidden. Freud examined the clock carefully. Unlike the physicists who had preceded him, he was less interested in the mechanics and more interested in the experiential effects. He asked Hartmann to wind the clock, and he positioned himself within the sphere of influence. When the effect began, Freud felt it immediately. It was, he would later write, like the sensation one sometimes has in dreams of experiencing an event and simultaneously remembering having experienced it before, a kind of temporal doubling that created a profound sense of déjà vu. But more than that, Freud felt as if some barrier in his own mind was momentarily thinning. Thoughts and memories that normally required effort to access seemed to float closer to the surface of consciousness. It was as if the clock's reversal of mechanical time was somehow resonating with the timeless realm of the unconscious, where all experiences exist simultaneously, where past and present merge. The effect lasted only seconds, but when it ended, Freud stood silent for a long moment. Then he said to Hartmann, "This is perhaps the most extraordinary thing I have ever experienced. I do not know what you have created, but it touches on something fundamental about human consciousness and memory." Freud's interest in the clock would lead to one of the most unusual experiments in the early history of psychoanalysis. But before we explore that, we must understand more about the cultural moment in which all of this was occurring. Vienna in 1902 was a city obsessed with both past and future. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was ancient, tracing its roots back through centuries, clinging to traditions and forms that many saw as increasingly archaic. And yet, the city was also at the forefront of modernity, producing revolutionary ideas in art, music, philosophy, and science. This tension between old and new, between tradition and innovation, between established certainty and unsettling new possibilities, created a peculiar atmosphere in which something like Hartmann's clock could be taken seriously. In a city where artists were painting dreams and doctors were exploring the unconscious, where architects were stripping away ornament and composers were abandoning traditional harmony, a clock that ran backward did not seem quite as impossible as it might have elsewhere. The clock became a kind of physical metaphor for the age itself, a symbol of the way Vienna was trying to move forward and backward simultaneously, to embrace the future while longing for the past. And as winter turned to spring in 1902, and word of the clock continued to spread through the city's salons and coffeehouses, its influence would extend into unexpected areas of Viennese cultural life, creating ripples that would persist long after the clock itself had disappeared. But that part of the story begins in the smoke-filled rooms where Vienna's intellectuals gathered each evening, where coffee and conversation flowed endlessly, where the fate of empires and the nature of reality were debated with equal passion. Part 3. Sigmund Freud's Encounter. The Wednesday Psychological Society met every week at Burggasse 19, in Freud's own apartment. The group had formed in 1902, just a few months before Freud first encountered the backwards clock. It consisted of a small circle of physicians and intellectuals interested in Freud's new approach to psychology. Wilhelm Steckel, Alfred Adler, Max Kahane, and Rudolf Reitler were the core members, though others would join as the years progressed. These Wednesday evening meetings were informal affairs. Participants would gather in Freud's waiting room, which doubled as a study, surrounded by the growing collection of ancient artifacts that fascinated him almost as much as the workings of the human mind: Egyptian statues, Greek pottery, Roman sculptures, all purchased from dealers in Vienna's antique markets. They would sit in a cloud of cigar smoke. Freud was a prodigious smoker, often going through 20 cigars in a day, and discuss case studies, debate theoretical points, and explore the strange territories of the unconscious mind that Freud was mapping with his new technique of psychoanalysis. On a Wednesday evening in early March 1902, after the usual discussions had concluded, Freud told the group about his visit to Hartmann's shop and his experience with the backwards clock. "I know this will sound extraordinary," he began, "but I must relate to you something I encountered recently that has profound implications for our understanding of mental time." He described the clock's mechanism, the sphere of temporal distortion it created, and most importantly, the psychological effects he had experienced while within its influence. It was, he explained, as if the normal barriers between conscious and unconscious thought had become more permeable. Memories and associations that would typically require the work of analysis to uncover presented themselves with unusual clarity. The group's response was mixed. Adler, always somewhat skeptical of Freud's more speculative ideas, suggested that the effect was purely suggestion. Freud had expected to experience something unusual, and so he had. Steckel, more imaginatively inclined, was fascinated and wanted to visit the Clockmaker himself. The others fell somewhere in between. "I propose an experiment," Freud said. "With Hartmann's permission, I would like to conduct several psychoanalytic sessions in the presence of this clock to observe whether its effect can facilitate the therapeutic process." This was a radical suggestion. Psychoanalysis was already controversial enough without adding what might appear to be mysticism or supernatural elements. But Freud was genuinely curious about the potential applications of the clock's unusual properties. Hartmann, when approached about this proposal, was hesitant. His shop was not suited for private psychoanalytic sessions, and he was concerned about what might happen if the clock's effects were combined with the already unpredictable process of exploring the unconscious. But Freud was persuasive, and eventually a compromise was reached. Hartmann would bring the clock to Freud's consulting room at Bergasse 19. The sessions would take place there, under controlled conditions, with only Freud, the patient, and Hartmann himself present. If anything went wrong, the clock could be immediately removed. The first experimental session took place on a gray Thursday afternoon in mid-March. The patient was a middle-aged woman Freud had been treating for severe anxiety and recurrent nightmares. She had been in analysis for several months with limited progress. There was clearly some traumatic memory from her childhood that she could not consciously access, but all of Freud's usual techniques had failed to bring it to the surface. Freud explained to her that they would be trying something unusual that day. He did not go into detail about the clock's properties, not wanting to influence her expectations too strongly. He simply said that a special timepiece would be present during the session, and that it might help her remember things more easily. The woman lay on Freud's famous couch, a piece of furniture that would become iconic in the history of psychoanalysis, covered with an oriental rug and surrounded by pillows. Freud sat in his chair behind the head of the couch, where the patient could not see him. This arrangement was deliberate. Freud believed that without the distraction of seeing the analyst's reactions, patients could focus more completely on their own internal experience. Hartmann sat quietly in a corner of the room, the backwards clock on his lap. At Freud's signal, He wound the mechanism and set the clock down on a small table. The clock began to tick. Its backwards motion was visible through the glass face, the hands moving leftward around the dial. And as the temporal distortion field came into being, Freud and his patient entered that strange state where time seemed to flow in multiple directions at once. "Tell me about your earliest memory," Freud said quietly. The woman began to speak. Her voice had a dreamy quality, as if she were half asleep or under hypnosis, though Freud had not attempted to hypnotize her. She described a garden from her childhood, a particular summer day, the smell of roses and cut grass. "Go deeper," Freud urged. "What happened in that garden?" And suddenly, in the 15 seconds before the clock stopped, something broke through. The woman gasped and began to speak rapidly, describing a traumatic incident she had completely forgotten, a frightening encounter with a violent adult, a memory she had repressed for decades. When the clock stopped and the effect ended, she lay on the couch, breathing heavily, tears streaming down her face. But there was also a sense of relief in her expression. The hidden memory had been brought to light. Freud was astounded. What would normally take weeks or months of careful analysis had been achieved in seconds. The backwards clock had somehow facilitated a journey into the past that would have been far more difficult without it. They conducted several more such sessions over the following weeks, with his patient and with others. The results were variable. The clock did not work equally well for everyone, and sometimes it produced no noticeable effect at all. But in a significant number of cases, it did seem to help patients access repressed memories more easily. Freud became increasingly convinced that the clock was resonating with something fundamental about how the mind works. In the interpretation of dreams, he had argued that the unconscious knows no time, that all experiences exist simultaneously in the depths of the psyche. Perhaps the clock's reversal of mechanical time was somehow temporarily aligning conscious experience with this timeless realm of the unconscious. He began to develop a theory, which he discussed with the Wednesday Psychological Society. What if time, as we consciously experience it, is actually a construct of the ego, a way of organizing experience that serves practical purposes but does not reflect the true nature of mental reality? What if the backwards clock was temporarily disrupting this construct, allowing access to the more fluid temporal experience of the unconscious? Not everyone in the group was convinced. Adler argued that Freud was reading too much into what might be nothing more than a combination of suggestion and coincidence. The clock's effects, he said, could not be reliably demonstrated under controlled conditions. What seemed to happen in Freud's consulting room might simply be the result of the doctor's own powerful personality and his patient's desire to please him. The debates grew heated. The Wednesday Psychological Society, which had been harmonious in its early months, began to splinter over this and other issues. Adler's growing skepticism about some of Freud's theories would eventually lead him to break away entirely and form his own school of psychology. But in the spring of 1902, these schisms were still in the future. For now, the backwards clock continued to fascinate and puzzle those who encountered it. News of Freud's experiments spread through Vienna's medical and psychological communities. Some practitioners were intrigued and wanted to try using the clock in their own work. Others were scandalized, seeing it as a descent into pseudoscience and charlatanism. Dr. Ernst Braun, the physicist who had first scientifically examined the clock, heard about Freud's work and visited him to discuss it. The conversation between the physicist and the psychoanalyst was, by all accounts, extraordinary. Here were two men approaching the same phenomenon from completely different angles. One concerned with the mechanics of time itself, the other with the experience of time and human consciousness. And yet both were convinced they were dealing with something genuinely anomalous. The question is, Braun said, whether the clock is actually affecting time or merely affecting our perception of time. As a physicist, I want to believe it's the former. But I must admit, the effects we observe are subtle enough that they could be perceptual rather than physical. And as a psychologist, Freud replied, I am not certain the distinction matters as much as you might think. If the clock changes how we experience time, and if that change allows access to previously inaccessible mental content, then it is doing something real regardless of the ultimate physical mechanism. This conversation touched on questions that philosophers had debated for centuries. Is time objective or subjective? Does it exist independent of consciousness? Or is it a product of how minds organize experience? The backwards clock seemed to exist at the intersection of these questions, neither purely physical nor purely psychological, but somehow both at once. Meanwhile, Hartmann himself was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the attention his creation had attracted. His quiet shop, which he had run for decades with minimal notice from the outside world, was now receiving a steady stream of visitors, all wanting to see the famous backwards clock, all wanting to experience its effects. Some came out of scientific curiosity, like Braun and his colleagues. Others came seeking something more mystical or spiritual. Vienna had a thriving occult underground, and word had spread in those circles that a clockmaker had created a device that could transcend normal time. Hartmann turned these visitors away, but they kept coming. He began to regret ever creating the clock. What had started as an interesting technical challenge, and then an exploration of theoretical possibilities, had become something burdensome, even frightening. He had opened a door to something he did not fully understand, and now he could not close it. In April, an incident occurred that deepened Hartmann's unease. A young man came to the shop one evening just before closing. He claimed to be a student of philosophy at the university, and he begged to be allowed to experience the clock's effects. He had heard about Freud's experiments, he said, and he believed the clock might help him understand time in a way that would revolutionize philosophical thought. Hartmann, tired and wanting to be left alone, refused. But the young man became insistent, almost desperate. There was something unbalanced in his manner, something that made Hartmann nervous. He asked the young man to leave, and eventually, reluctantly, he did. That night, Hartmann was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. Someone had thrown a brick through the window of his shop. He hurried downstairs and found the young philosophy student standing among the broken glass, having climbed through the shattered window. I need to experience it, the young man said, his eyes wild. I need to understand. Don't you see? If time can run backward, then everything we think we know is wrong. Everything. Hartmann faced the intruder calmly, though his heart was pounding. Young man, he said, you are not well. The clock cannot give you what you're seeking. It is simply a mechanism, nothing more. You're lying, the student said. Freud used it to unlock memories. Scientists have measured temporal distortions. It's real. It proves that time is not what we think it is. The commotion had attracted attention. A night watchman appeared, and the young man was escorted away. The police were called, and statements were taken. The student was identified as having a history of mental instability and was remanded to the care of his family. But the incident shook Hartmann deeply. His creation had become more than just an unusual clock. It had become a symbol, a focal point for people's anxieties and fascinations about the nature of reality. Some saw it as proof of hidden truths. Others saw it as a dangerous delusion. And Hartmann, who had simply wanted to explore an interesting technical problem, found himself at the center of a controversy he had never sought. He went to Freud and told him that the experiments must stop. The clock needed to disappear from public attention. Freud understood, though he was disappointed. The psychological applications of the clock had only begun to be explored, and there was so much more that could be learned. But Freud also recognized that Hartmann was right. The clock had attracted too much attention, and much of it was unhealthy. Better to let it fade back into obscurity than to risk further incidents. They agreed that Freud would conduct one final session using the clock, and then it would be returned to Hartmann's shop and the experiments would end. The final session took place on a rainy evening in late April. The patient was a young artist who had been suffering from a creative block. He could no longer paint, he said, because time had become meaningless to him. He experienced each moment as disconnected from the next, with no sense of continuity or flow. It was, he said, as if he was living in a series of isolated snapshots, rather than in a continuous stream of experience. Freud recognized this as a severe dissociative state, likely triggered by some psychological trauma. He hoped that the backwards clock might help the artist reconnect with his sense of temporal continuity, though he acknowledged to himself that this was somewhat paradoxical, using a device that disrupted normal time to restore a normal sense of time. The session proceeded as the others had. The artist lay on the couch, Hartmann wound the clock, and the temporal distortion field came into being. But this time, something different happened. Instead of the usual 15 seconds, the clock kept running. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. The effect did not diminish. If anything, it seemed to intensify. The air in the consulting room took on that strange quality of heat shimmer, but denser, more pronounced. The artist on the couch began to speak, but his words came out in a strange order, sentences fragmenting and reassembling. I am painting, was painting, will paint, the past and future are the same. I can see them all at once. Freud, alarmed, signaled to Hartmann to stop the clock. But Hartmann couldn't move. He later described feeling as if he were trapped in some kind of temporal loop, unable to act even though he was conscious of the need to act. The clock ran for 7 minutes before it finally stopped on its own. When the effect ended, all three men sat in stunned silence. The artist was weeping quietly, but there was a strange smile on his face. I understand now, he whispered. Time is not a line. It's a circle or a spiral or something beyond either. We experience it as linear only because that's all our minds can process. But it's really, he trailed off, unable to find words for what he had experienced. That night, after Hartmann had taken the clock back to his shop and Freud had seen the artist home, with instructions to return for a follow-up appointment, Freud sat alone in his study and wrote in his journal. Today, I witnessed something that may change how we understand consciousness itself, he wrote. The backwards clock, in its extended operation, seemed to create a state where past, present, and future became accessible simultaneously. The experience was clearly profound, possibly traumatic. I do not know whether we have done the artist a service or a disservice. What is clear is that we have touched something fundamental, something that ordinarily remains hidden. The mind, I am convinced, does not experience time the way the clock measures it. In the unconscious, all moments exist together, and it is only the ego that imposes sequence and order. Hartmann's clock temporarily removes that imposition. What we see, then, is the raw temporal nature of consciousness itself, undiluted by the organizing principles we normally take for granted. It is both fascinating and terrifying. I will not use the clock again. The risks are too great. But I will never forget what it revealed. Freud was true to his word. The backwards clock disappeared from his consulting room, and he never mentioned it in his published writings. But those who knew him well said that his experience with the clock influenced his thinking in subtle ways, particularly his ideas about how the unconscious operates outside of normal time. The artist from that final session did eventually recover his ability to paint, but his work changed dramatically. His later paintings had a strange, disorienting quality, as if they were trying to capture multiple moments in time simultaneously. Art critics found them fascinating but difficult to interpret. The artist himself said little about them, except to note that after a particular evening in April 1902, he had seen time differently. And in his quiet shop on a narrow street in the Near Stadt, Johann Hartmann returned the backwards clock to its locked cabinet and tried to resume his normal life. But he knew that nothing would ever be quite normal again. He had created something that changed how people understood reality, and that kind of change cannot be unmade. The clock was silent now, its spring unwound, its hands frozen. But the questions it had raised continued to tick onward, impossible to stop, impossible to ignore. Part 4. The Coffeehouse Debates. News of the backwards clock spread through Vienna like a slow but inexorable tide, flowing from the scientific community into the broader intellectual culture that made the city such a fertile ground for new ideas. By May of 1902, it seemed that everyone in Vienna's cafes was talking about time, about consciousness, about the nature of reality itself. The Café Central, that magnificent establishment on Herrengasse, with its soaring vaulted ceilings and rows of marble-top tables, became the epicenter of these debates. This was where the city's intellectuals gathered, where ideas were born and dismantled, where reputations were made and destroyed over endless cups of coffee and glasses of brandy. On any given evening, you might find poets arguing with physicists, painters debating with philosophers, journalists taking notes while pretending not to listen. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and possibility. This was Vienna at its best, a place where minds met and sparked against each other like flints producing intellectual fire. Among the regular habitués of the Café Central was Peter Altenburg, the writer who famously used the café as his official address. Altenburg was a peculiar figure even in a city that celebrated eccentricity. He lived mostly in hotels and cafes, wrote fragmented, impressionistic pieces that were both celebrated and mocked, and had a gift for capturing the fleeting moments of modern urban life. When Altenburg heard about the backwards clock, he was immediately inspired. He began writing a series of short vignettes about time, about memory, about the way past and present bleed into each other in consciousness. These pieces were published in various newspapers and literary journals, and they helped spread the clock's fame beyond scientific circles. One of Altenburg's pieces, published in late May, captured something essential about the cultural moment. There's a clock in Vienna that runs backward. I have not seen it myself, but I have spoken to those who have. They say it makes one dizzy, disoriented, as if the world has tilted on its axis. But is this not how we always experience time when we are truly alive? Does the past not rush forward into the present? Do we not constantly live backward and forward simultaneously, remembering and anticipating, haunted and hopeful? Perhaps this clockmaker has simply made visible what was always true, that time is not the tyrant we imagine it to be. Such romantic musings appealed to the literary set, but they frustrated the scientists who had actually examined the clock. Dr. Braun, reading Altenburg's piece over coffee at the Café Museum, his preferred establishment, with its starkly modern Adolf loose interior, felt compelled to write a response. His article, published in a popular science journal, attempted to separate fact from fancy. Yes, the clock produced measurable temporal effects. No, These effects did not mean that time was merely subjective or that mystical interpretations were justified. The clock was a physical phenomenon that would eventually be explained by physics, not poetry. But Braun's sober scientific tone did little to dampen the public's fascination. If anything, the debate between scientific and artistic interpretations only made the clock more famous. People loved a mystery, especially one that existed at the intersection of science and philosophy, mechanism and meaning. The Vienna Secession, the group of avant-garde artists led by Gustav Klimt, became interested in the clock from an artistic perspective. Klimt himself was said to be fascinated by the idea of time running backward. His paintings already had a dreamlike, timeless quality, with their golden backgrounds and symbolic imagery. The notion of temporal reversal resonated with his aesthetic vision. Joseph Hoffman, the designer and architect who was part of the secession movement, proposed creating an art installation inspired by the backwards clock. He envisioned a room where every element would be designed to create a sense of temporal disorientation. Clocks running at different speeds or in different directions, mirrors positioned to create infinite regress, furniture that seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. The project was never realized, but the sketches and plans that Hoffman created were exhibited at the Secession Building, the stunning Art Nouveau structure that had been built just a few years earlier. The exhibition drew large crowds and sparked intense discussions about the relationship between time, perception, and art. Meanwhile, in the city's cafes, the debates continued nightly. At the Café Greenstidel, or rather at the newer establishments that had replaced it after its 1897 demolition, young writers of the Young Vienna movement, Arthur Schnitzler, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Felix Salten, discussed the clock's implications for literature. Schnitzler in particular was intrigued. His plays and stories often dealt with the fluidity of time and memory, with the way consciousness can slip between different temporal registers. His play Rage In, known in English as La Ronde, written around this time, presents a series of sexual encounters that form a circle, with the last scene connecting back to the first, a kind of temporal loop that echoes the circular nature of the backwards clock. Hofmannsthal, meanwhile, was wrestling with a creative crisis that would culminate in his famous Lord Chandos letter, a fictional letter in which a young nobleman describes his inability to use language effectively after experiencing a profound shift in consciousness. Some scholars would later suggest that the backwards clock incident influenced this work, though Hofmannsthal never explicitly said so. The philosophical debates were perhaps even more intense than the artistic ones. At the university, professors and students argued about the nature of time with renewed vigor, inspired by the concrete example of the backwards clock. One group, influenced by the German idealist tradition and philosophers like Kant and Hegel, argued that the clock proved time was merely a construct of consciousness. If time could be reversed by a mechanical device, then clearly it had no objective existence independent of mind. Another group, more empirically minded, insisted that the clock changed only the local flow of time within a limited sphere, and that this was consistent with time being an objective feature of physical reality. They pointed to the fact that the effects were measurable and reproducible, characteristics of genuine physical phenomena. A third group took a more mystical view, suggesting that the clock had somehow tapped into a deeper level of reality where different laws applied. Perhaps, they speculated, there were multiple layers or dimensions of time, and the clock was allowing limited access to one of these normally hidden dimensions. These debates attracted the attention of physicists throughout Europe. Ernst Mach, the Austrian physicist and philosopher who had deeply influenced a generation of thinkers with his ideas about perception and relativity, heard about the clock, and expressed interest in examining it. However, by this time, Hartmann had largely withdrawn from public life, and he politely declined Mach's request to visit. The young Albert Einstein, still working in the Swiss patent office but already thinking deeply about time and space, apparently heard about the Vienna backwards clock through scientific correspondence. Whether it influenced his development of special relativity is impossible to say definitively, but it's intriguing to note that Einstein's revolutionary 1905 paper on relativity dealt centrally with the nature of time and showed that it was far more flexible and relative than classical physics had supposed. At the Café Museum, where the scientific and artistic communities often overlapped, the discussions sometimes became quite technical. Dr. Braun and his colleagues would explain the physics of thermodynamics and entropy, trying to clarify why time normally appears to flow in only one direction. Imagine a film of cream being stirred into coffee, Braun would explain. If you watch it forward, you see the cream gradually dispersing until the coffee becomes uniformly colored. If you run the film backward, you see the dispersed cream somehow gathering itself back together into distinct swirls. The backward version looks wrong, impossible. But why? The underlying physical laws work the same in both directions. It's probability that creates the arrow of time. It's extraordinarily unlikely that dispersed cream would spontaneously reconcentrate, even though it's not technically impossible. But your clockmaker has made a device that apparently does cause such unlikely things to happen. A philosopher might counter. Objects moving backward, events reversing themselves. Doesn't that suggest there's something incomplete about our understanding of physical law? These conversations could last for hours, fueled by coffee and the peculiar intellectual energy that Vienna seemed to generate in those years. One evening in June, a particularly memorable debate occurred at the Café Central. Present were Dr. Braun, Peter Altenburg, a young composer named Arnold Schoenberg who would later revolutionize music, a philosophy professor from the university, and several journalists who saw a good story developing. The question under discussion: did the backwards clock prove that free will was an illusion? The argument ran something like this: if time could run backward, and if running backward meant that effects preceded their causes, then clearly the future could influence the past. But if the future was influencing the past, then the past was already determined by the future, which meant everything was predetermined, which meant free will did not exist. Counterarguments were offered. The clock only affected a tiny sphere of space for a few seconds. This didn't prove anything about the nature of time, generally. Moreover, the effects observed were subtle and ambiguous. Perhaps they were mere tricks of perception rather than genuine temporal reversal. But even if it's only perception, the philosopher insisted, that's still significant. It means our sense of moving forward through time, of having past and future clearly separated, is fragile, easily disrupted. What does that say about the reliability of our other intuitions about reality? Schoenberg, the composer, offered a different perspective. In music, he said, we play with time constantly. A melody exists in time, but when we hear it, we experience it as a unified whole, with earlier notes colored by our anticipation of later notes, and later notes echoing earlier ones. Music doesn't really move forward. It exists in a kind of eternal present, where all the notes are connected across time. The backwards clock, he continued, reminds me of what happens when you play a musical phrase in retrograde, when you take a sequence of notes and reverse their order. Sometimes the retrograde is just as beautiful as the original, sometimes even more so. It's the same notes, the same intervals, but experienced in a different temporal order. Perhaps time is more like music than we realize. Not a simple forward march, but a complex structure where order matters, but where multiple orderings are possible. This musical metaphor appealed to the artists present, while frustrating the scientists who wanted to keep the discussion grounded in physical reality. But it captured something important about how the backwards clock was being received in Vienna's cultural imagination, not just as a scientific anomaly, but as a symbol, a provocation, an invitation to rethink fundamental assumptions. The journalists present wrote articles about these cafe debates, and the articles were widely read. The backwards clock became, briefly, one of those cultural touchstones that everyone had an opinion about, even if few people had actually seen it. Satirists had a field day. Cartoons appeared in newspapers showing politicians as clockmakers, desperately trying to turn back time on their failed policies. A satirical cabaret show included a sketch about a man who buys a backwards clock thinking it will make him younger, only to discover it just makes him confused. Even the more serious cultural commentators found symbolic resonance in the clock. One influential critic wrote, "Vienna in 1902 is itself a backwards clock. We are an ancient empire trying to function in the modern world, constantly looking backward to our glorious past while the future rushes toward us whether we're ready or not. No wonder a device that makes time run backward captures our imagination. It represents our deepest wish and our greatest fear." This cultural reading of the clock as a symbol of Austria-Hungary's predicament was perceptive. The empire was indeed caught between past and future, between tradition and modernity. Within a little over a decade, the entire structure would collapse in the catastrophe of World War I. But in 1902, that future disaster was still invisible, and people could debate the nature of time in coffee houses without yet knowing how brutally time would soon transform their world. The Vienna Werkstatt, the workshop collective founded by Joseph Hoffman and Kallman Moser as part of the secession movement, created a series of decorative objects inspired by the backwards clock. There are pendants with watch faces that ran counterclockwise, prints showing spiraling patterns that seemed to move backward when you stared at them, even wallpaper designs that created temporal disorientation through clever visual tricks. These objects became fashionable among Vienna's artistic elite. To own something from the Ruckwarts, backwards, collection signaled that you were modern, sophisticated, aware of the philosophical questions raised by the famous clock. Sigmund Freud, meanwhile, largely stayed out of these public debates. His experiments with the clock had been private, and he preferred to keep them that way. But his colleagues in the Wednesday Psychological Society were less discreet, and word leaked out that the famous doctor had been using the backwards clock in psychoanalytic sessions. This revelation produced mixed reactions. Some hailed it as proof of Freud's innovative approach, his willingness to explore unconventional methods in the service of healing. Others used it as ammunition in their attacks on psychoanalysis, claiming it showed that Freud's methods were unscientific, even fraudulent. Freud himself remained characteristically confident in the face of criticism. When a journalist asked him about the backwards clock experiments, he gave a carefully worded response. The investigation of unusual phenomena can sometimes illuminate ordinary processes. Whether the clock truly affects time or merely affects perception is less important than what it reveals about the temporal structure of consciousness. In that respect, it was a valuable research tool, though one I no longer employ. By July, the intense public interest in the backwards clock was beginning to fade. This was partly because Hartmann had firmly closed his shop to visitors and refused all requests to display or demonstrate the clock. Without new information or experiences to fuel speculation, the debates gradually lost their energy. But the clock's brief prominence had left its mark on Viennese culture. It had become part of the city's intellectual landscape, a reference point in discussions about time, consciousness, and reality. For years afterward, people would refer to the backwards clock incident as a moment when Vienna had collectively questioned its assumptions about the nature of things. And in the coffee houses, discussions continued, though with less intensity than before. The questions the clock had raised could not be answered definitively, but they could be endlessly discussed, refined, explored from different angles. This was what Vienna's cafe culture excelled at, keeping ideas alive through conversation, allowing them to evolve and develop through dialectical exchange. The backwards clock had sparked something that would outlive the device itself, a sustained meditation on time, memory, and consciousness that would influence Viennese intellectual life for years to come. In a city obsessed with both past and future, a clock that ran backward was more than just a curiosity. It was a mirror held up to the soul of the age. Part 5. The Science and the Mystery. To truly understand what Johann Hartmann had created, we need to delve deeper into the physics of time, both as it was understood in 1902 and as we understand it today. The backwards clock raised questions that physicists are still grappling with more than a century later. Time is perhaps the most familiar and yet most mysterious aspect of our experience. We measure it constantly, structure our lives around it. Yet when we try to define what it actually is, we find ourselves grasping at shadows. In 1902, the dominant view of time in physics came from Isaac Newton, who had described time as absolute and universal, flowing equably without regard to anything external. In Newton's conception, time was like a great river, carrying all events along at the same steady rate. The clock on the wall in London and the clock on the wall in Vienna ticked at exactly the same pace, measuring the same universal temporal flow. But even in 1902, there were hints that this picture was too simple. The equations of thermodynamics, developed in the mid-19th century, had introduced the concept of entropy and the arrow of time. As we discussed earlier, these equations explained why time appears to flow in only one direction, not because the fundamental laws of physics require it, but because of statistical probability. What Hartmann's clock suggested was that this statistical arrow might not be as rigid as it seemed. If a mechanical device could create even a small sphere where time behaved differently, where the normal progression from past to future could be disrupted or reversed, then perhaps time itself was more malleable than classical physics suggested. Dr. Ernst Braun and his colleagues at the University of Vienna spent months trying to understand the clock's mechanism. They took precise measurements, carefully documented every observation, and attempted to develop a theoretical framework that could explain what they were seeing. Their findings were perplexing. The clock's mechanism, while unusual, was entirely classical. There was nothing in the gearing or escapement that should produce the effects they observed. The addition of certain crystalline structures and unusual metal alloys in Hartmann's design seemed to be key, but why these materials created temporal effects was unclear. One of Braun's colleagues proposed that the crystals might be creating a resonance effect, vibrating at frequencies that somehow interfaced with the fundamental structure of space-time. This was highly speculative. In 1902, the concept of space-time as a unified four-dimensional structure didn't even exist yet. But the idea that certain configurations of matter might be able to affect the local flow of time was not entirely without precedent in theoretical physics. James Clerk Maxwell's equations, which unified electricity and magnetism, had predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves traveling at the speed of light. If electricity and magnetism could be unified into a single phenomenon, perhaps space and time could be similarly unified. And if they were unified, perhaps matter could affect time the way it clearly affected space. These ideas were in the air in the early 1900s, though they had not yet been fully formulated. Albert Einstein would revolutionize physics in 1905 with his special theory of relativity, showing that space and time were indeed unified into a four-dimensional space-time, and that the rate at which time flows depends on motion and gravity. But in 1902, these revolutionary ideas were still emerging. Hartmann's clock, in its strange way, seemed to be empirically demonstrating what would soon be theoretically predicted. That time was not absolute and universal, but relative and manipulable. What made the backwards clock particularly perplexing was the local nature of its effects. Outside the 2-meter sphere of influence, time flowed normally. Inside that sphere, it behaved differently. This suggested that the clock was creating some kind of field, perhaps analogous to electromagnetic or gravitational fields, that affected the temporal properties of space-time within a limited volume. Braun attempted to measure this hypothetical temporal field using various instruments, but the equipment available in 1902 was simply not sophisticated enough to detect whatever it was the clock was producing. He could observe the effects, objects moving backward, perceptual distortions, but he couldn't measure the cause. Modern physics has some concepts that might help us understand what Hartmann stumbled upon. In quantum mechanics, we've learned that particles can exist in superpositions of states, essentially being in multiple configurations simultaneously until they're observed. There's also a phenomenon called quantum entanglement, where particles can be connected in ways that seem to transcend normal space and time. More relevant to the backwards clock might be the concept of time symmetry in quantum mechanics. At the quantum level, the laws of physics are largely symmetric with respect to time. They work the same whether you run time forward or backward. It's only when you get to larger scales, where statistical effects dominate, that you see a clear arrow of time. Perhaps Hartmann's clock, through some combination of materials and mechanism, was creating a localized region where quantum effects became amplified to the macroscopic scale. Within that region, the normal statistical arrow of time might be temporarily overcome, allowing for genuinely time-symmetric behavior. This is, of course, speculation. We don't know exactly how Hartmann's clock worked because the detailed specifications of its construction were lost. But based on the descriptions of its effects, this quantum interpretation seems as plausible as any. There's another possibility worth considering, one that moves us from physics into metaphysics. What if the clock wasn't actually affecting time at all, but was instead affecting consciousness, specifically the way consciousness experiences and processes time? Freud's observations support this interpretation. The effects he witnessed in his psychoanalytic sessions suggested that the clock was somehow making the unconscious more accessible. Now, the unconscious, according to Freud, operates outside of normal time. Repressed memories from childhood can feel as immediate as recent events. Dreams mix past, present, and future freely. What if the backwards clock created a field that temporarily disrupted the ego's normal organization of temporal experience? What if it didn't make time run backward, but made consciousness experience time the way the unconscious experiences it, as a unified present where all moments coexist? This would explain why the effects seemed both physical and psychological. They were psychological, but psychology and physics aren't as separate as we sometimes imagine. Consciousness exists in the physical world, is produced by physical brains, and therefore might be affected by physical fields in ways we don't yet fully understand. The perceptual distortions reported by those who experience the clock's effects support this interpretation. People saw their own hands in two positions at once, experienced profound déjà vu, felt as if memories were becoming more accessible. These are all phenomena related to how the brain processes temporal information. There's a part of the brain called the hippocampus that's crucial for forming new memories and for organizing our sense of past, present, and future. Damage to the hippocampus can cause a condition where people lose their ability to form new memories and to imagine the future. Their consciousness becomes trapped in an eternal present. Perhaps Hartmann's clock was temporarily affecting the hippocampus or related brain structures, disrupting their normal function and creating a state where temporal organization broke down. This wouldn't be truly time travel, but it would create something that felt like it from the inside. There's also the question of how the clock stopped itself. Every time it was wound, it would run for anywhere from 10 seconds to a few minutes, then suddenly stop with that characteristic sound like an indrawn breath. What was causing this? Was it running out of energy? Or is something else happening? One hypothesis is that the temporal field the clock created became unstable and collapsed under its own paradoxes. If the clock was genuinely causing temporal reversal, even locally, it would create logical contradictions. Effects would precede causes. Information would flow backward. These paradoxes might create a kind of feedback that destabilized the field and caused the clock to stop. This is pure speculation, but it fits with some modern ideas about why time travel, if it's possible at all, might be severely constrained. Any mechanism that allowed genuine travel or communication backward in time would risk creating paradoxes. The famous grandfather paradox, where a time traveler could prevent their own existence. Perhaps the universe has built-in mechanisms that prevent such paradoxes, and Hartmann's clock was running into these mechanisms every time it tried to reverse time. The mystery of the backwards clock also connects to broader questions about the nature of time that physicists and philosophers are still debating. Is time fundamental or emergent? That is it a basic feature of reality, or does it emerge from more fundamental processes? Some physicists argue that time is an illusion, that at the deepest level of reality, perhaps in the quantum foam of space-time of the Planck scale, there is no time, no before and after, only a timeless present. Time, in this view, emerges only at larger scales through statistical and thermodynamic processes. If this is true, then perhaps Hartmann stumbled upon a way to temporarily access or reveal this timeless level of reality. Within the sphere of the clock's influence, the normal emergence of time might be disrupted, giving observers a brief glimpse of what reality looks like without time's structuring presence. This brings us to one of the most profound mysteries of the backwards clock. Why did it work at all? Hartmann himself couldn't fully explain what he'd done. He'd combined certain materials in a certain configuration, following intuition as much as theory, and somehow created something that produced genuine anomalies. This suggests that there might be properties of matter and mechanism that we still don't understand, hidden possibilities that could be revealed through the right combinations. The history of science is full of accidental discoveries, people stumbling upon phenomena they weren't looking for and couldn't initially explain. Hartmann's clock might have been one of these accidents, a glimpse of physics that was ahead of its time. Or perhaps it wasn't an accident at all. Perhaps Hartmann, through his years of working with intricate mechanisms, had developed an intuitive understanding of something that science hadn't yet formally recognized. Craftsmen and artisans sometimes develop knowledge that's procedural and intuitive rather than theoretical. They know how to do things without necessarily knowing why those things work. It's worth noting that many breakthrough inventions have come from this kind of intuitive knowledge. The Wright brothers, for example, didn't have a complete theoretical understanding of aerodynamics when they built their first successful airplane. They proceeded through trial and error, following their instincts about what might work. Hartmann might have done something similar with his backwards clock. Through experimentation and intuition, he found a configuration that produced temporal effects, even though he couldn't explain in rigorous theoretical terms why it worked. The tragedy is that this knowledge was lost. After the backwards clock incident, Hartmann never attempted to recreate or improve upon his design. He was too disturbed by what he'd created, too worried about the consequences of pursuing this line of research further. And when he died, as we'll discuss in a later chapter, his detailed notes and specifications apparently died with him. Scientists have occasionally attempted to recreate the backwards clock based on surviving descriptions, but none have succeeded. Either the descriptions are incomplete, or there was some crucial element that was never properly documented, or perhaps Hartmann's intuitive understanding of what he was doing simply can't be captured in words and diagrams. So the backwards clock remains a mystery, a device that apparently worked, that produced effects observed by multiple credible witnesses, but that can't be explained by current physics and can't be replicated using current technology. It sits in that frustrating category of historical anomalies that seem too well documented to dismiss as hoaxes or delusions, but that don't fit into our standard understanding of how the world works. Perhaps future physics will explain it. Perhaps as our understanding of quantum mechanics, gravity, and consciousness deepens, we'll see how Hartmann's combination of crystals and metals and intricate mechanism could produce localized temporal effects. Or perhaps the backwards clock will remain forever mysterious, a reminder that reality is stranger than our theories allow for, that the universe still has surprises in store for us. What's certain is that the clock raised questions that remain relevant today. What is time? Can it be manipulated? How does consciousness experience it? Is the past fixed or fluid? Can effects precede causes? These questions don't just belong to physics and philosophy. They touch on fundamental aspects of what it means to be human, to exist in time, to remember the past, and imagine the future. And in that sense, perhaps it doesn't matter whether we ever fully explain the backwards clock. Perhaps its real value lies in the questions it raised, the debates it sparked, the way it forced people to think more deeply about time and existence. Mystery, after all, is not a failure of knowledge. It's an invitation to wonder, to question, to explore. In Vienna in 1902, with its coffee houses full of artists and scientists all talking about a clock that ran backward, was a city deeply engaged in that kind of wonder. The backwards clock was eventually lost, but the questions it raised tick onward, backward, and forward through the corridors of time. Part 6. Personal Stories. While intellectuals debated the implications of the backwards clock in coffee houses and laboratories, ordinary people whose lives were touched by it had their own stories to tell. These accounts, some documented in letters and diaries, others passed down through family memories, provide a more personal perspective on the clock's strange influence. Let me tell you about Anna Bergman. Anna was a seamstress who lived in a modest apartment in Vienna's 7th district. She was 32 years old in 1902, unmarried, supporting herself through long hours of painstaking work creating dresses for middle-class clients. Her life was one of routine and responsibility, with little room for mystery or wonder. But Anna had a problem that no amount of hard work could solve. She suffered from severe, recurring nightmares. Almost every night, she would wake in a panic, her heart racing, her sheets soaked with sweat, haunted by dreams she could never quite remember upon waking. All she knew was that they filled her with dread, with a sense of something terrible looming just beyond her consciousness. These nightmares had plagued her since childhood, but they'd worsened in recent years. They left her exhausted, anxious, unable to concentrate on her work. She'd consulted several doctors, but none had been able to help. They prescribed various tonics and therapies, none of which made any difference. Then, in April 1902, a friend told her about a doctor who was using unusual methods to help people with psychological problems. This doctor, Sigmund Freud, believed that nightmares and anxieties stemmed from repressed memories, and that bringing these memories to consciousness could cure the symptoms. Anna was skeptical but desperate. She made an appointment. During her second session with Freud, the backwards clock was present. Freud had explained to her that he was experimenting with a device that might help her access buried memories more easily. Anna had no idea what he meant, but she trusted him to try. When Hartmann wound the clock and it began to tick, Anna felt something shift inside her mind. It was as if a door she hadn't known existed suddenly opened. And through that door came flooding a memory she had completely forgotten. She was 4 years old, visiting her uncle's farm in the countryside outside Vienna. There had been a storm, a terrible storm, and the barn had caught fire. She remembered running through the rain, seeing the flames, hearing the screaming of the horses trapped inside. Her uncle had run into the burning building to save them, and she had watched, terrified, as he disappeared into the smoke. He had survived, she now remembered. He had saved the horses and escaped with minor burns. But 4-year-old Anna had been convinced she was watching him die, and that trauma had been too overwhelming to process. So her mind had buried it, locked it away, but the fear had leaked out in her nightmares for the next 28 years. As Anna lay on Freud's couch, sobbing as this memory returned to her, she felt something profound shift. The nightmares that had haunted her for so long suddenly made sense. They weren't warning her of future danger. They were echoes of a past danger that her conscious mind had forgotten. After that session, Anna's nightmares stopped. Not gradually, but immediately. She slept peacefully for the first time in years. The change was so dramatic that she became one of Freud's most enthusiastic advocates, telling everyone she knew about the miracle cure she'd experienced. But Anna's story had a strange postscript. About a month after her session with the backwards clock, she began experiencing episodes of what she described as remembering forward. She would suddenly have vivid, detailed visions of events that were about to happen. Not major events, just small moments from her daily life. She would remember dropping a thimble before she dropped it, or remember a customer arriving before the door opened. These episodes lasted only a few seconds, and they came randomly, perhaps once or twice a week. They didn't disturb Anna. In fact, she found them rather interesting. But they did suggest that her exposure to the clock's temporal effects had created some lasting change in how her consciousness processed time. Then there was the case of Leopold Strasberg. Leopold was a clockmaker himself, though not of Hartmann's caliber. He ran a small repair shop specializing in fixing broken timepieces. When he heard about Hartmann's backwards clock, he was determined to see it for himself, not out of scientific curiosity, but out of professional jealousy. Leopold was embittered by what he saw as his own lack of recognition. He was a skilled craftsman, he believed, but he had never created anything remarkable, never made his mark on the profession. And now Hartmann, who had worked in relative obscurity for decades, had suddenly become famous for creating this extraordinary device. One evening in May, Leopold showed up at Hartmann's shop, drunk and angry. He demanded to see the famous clock to understand how it worked. Hartmann, recognizing that Leopold was not in a stable state, refused. But Leopold became increasingly belligerent, shouting that Hartmann had no right to keep such a discovery to himself. The confrontation ended with Leopold being forcibly removed by a passing policeman. But the encounter had rattled Hartmann, who began to worry that his creation might inspire violence or unstable behavior in others. Leopold, for his part, went home and began trying to recreate the backwards clock based on rumors and secondhand descriptions. For weeks, he worked obsessively, barely eating or sleeping, filling his workshop with increasingly strange mechanisms. He never succeeded in creating a working backwards clock, but the attempt changed him. The obsession burned out his jealousy, replaced it with a kind of humility. He came to understand that Hartmann's achievement wasn't just a matter of technical skill, but involved some deeper intuition or insight that Leopold didn't possess. He eventually went to Hartmann's shop to apologize. The two men talked for hours, and Hartmann, moved by Leopold's sincerity, showed him detailed diagrams of the backwards clock's mechanism. Leopold studied them carefully, then admitted he still didn't understand how it worked. "But that's the wonder of it," he said. "You created something that transcends ordinary craftsmanship, something that touches on mysteries I can't even name. I was wrong to be jealous. You've done something remarkable, and I'm honored to have been able to see even a glimpse of it." After that conversation, Leopold returned to his ordinary work with renewed dedication. He never again tried to create anything revolutionary, but his repairs became more thoughtful, more careful, infused with a new appreciation for the mystery inherent in even the simplest mechanism. Time, he come to understand, was more than just gears and springs. Another personal story involved a young woman named Elise Mahler, no relation to the composer Gustav Mahler. Elise was a pianist, talented but struggling, trying to make a living giving lessons and playing at salon concerts. She had a peculiar problem. She could play music beautifully when alone, but fell apart when performing for others. The anxiety of being watched, of being judged, disrupted her ability to lose herself in the music. A friend who had heard about Freud's experiments suggested Elise might benefit from psychoanalysis. Elise was reluctant. She didn't think her performance anxiety was a sign of deep psychological problems, but eventually she agreed to try. During her session, when the backwards clock was running, Elise experienced something extraordinary. She felt as if she were simultaneously in Freud's consulting room and in her childhood home, sitting at her family's piano. She was 5 years old again, playing her first recital piece while her parents and their friends listened critically. She felt the pressure, the fear of making a mistake, the sense that her worth as a person was being judged through her performance. And she felt how that pressure had frozen something inside her, created a knot of anxiety that had persisted ever since. But she also felt something else. In that strange temporal overlap created by the clock, she could bring her adult perspective to that childhood experience. She could understand that her young self had been carrying an unfair burden, that mistakes were acceptable, that her worth didn't depend on perfect performance. After the session, Elise's performance anxiety didn't disappear entirely, but it lessened significantly. More importantly, she had a new understanding of her relationship with music. She realized she'd been playing to prove something, to ward off judgment, rather than for the joy of the music itself. She began to rebuild her approach to piano from the ground up, focusing on her own enjoyment rather than on pleasing audiences. Ironically, as she cared less about how others judged her playing, her performances improved dramatically. Within a year, she was receiving invitations to play at better venues, and her career began to flourish. Elise later said that the session with the backwards clock had allowed her to go back and re-experience a crucial moment in her development, to add new understanding to an old memory, and that this had freed her from a pattern that had constrained her for 2 decades. These personal stories, Anna's cure, Leopold's transformation, Elise's liberation, all shared a common theme. The backwards clock had allowed people to revisit their pasts, not physically, but psychologically, and this revisitation had created the possibility of change. By going backward, they had found a way to move forward. There were darker stories, too. A middle-aged merchant named Franz Halser experienced the clock's effects during one of Dr. Braun's experiments. Franz had volunteered as a test subject, curious about the strange device he'd read about in the newspapers. During the experiment, Franz had a terrifying experience. He felt as if his entire life was reversing itself, as if he were rapidly aging backward through all the years of his existence. He experienced himself as a young man, then as an adolescent, then as a child, each stage of his life flashing by in reverse. The sensation lasted only a few seconds, but to Franz it felt like an eternity. When it ended, he was shaking and pale. He left the laboratory immediately and refused to discuss what he'd experienced. In the weeks that followed, Franz became deeply depressed. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was meaningless, that all his accomplishments and experiences were as insubstantial as a film played backward. He withdrew from his family and friends, stopped going to work, sat for hours staring at nothing. Eventually, with the help of a doctor and the passage of time, Franz recovered. But he never forgot the existential dread that the backwards clock had triggered in him. He would later say it was as if the clock had shown him something about the nature of existence that he was better off not knowing. This darker outcome troubled those who had been experimenting with the clock. It suggested that the device's effects weren't universally beneficial, that for some people, the disruption of normal temporal experience could be psychologically dangerous. Freud took Franz's case seriously. It reinforced his decision to stop using the clock in psychoanalytic sessions. The mind, he realized, has its own reasons for organizing experience the way it does, for keeping past and present separated. To disrupt that organization could sometimes be therapeutic, but it could also be harmful. There was also the strange case of the Hartmann family themselves, though we know less about this because they were extremely private about their experiences. Johann Hartmann had a wife, Greta, and 2 adult children who had moved away for Vienna. When news of the backwards clock spread, his family became concerned for his well-being. They worried that the attention and controversy were too stressful for a man of his age. Greta Hartmann apparently experienced the clock's effects herself, though the details are unclear. What is known is that afterward, she became deeply religious in a way she hadn't been before. She began attending Mass daily and spending hours in prayer. When asked about this change, she would only say that the clock had shown her that time was not what she had thought it was, and that if time could be disrupted by a mechanical device, then perhaps the material world was less solid and permanent than it appeared. This had led her to contemplate eternal things, spiritual realities that existed outside of time. Whether this was a healthy spiritual awakening or a form of psychological disturbance was debated by those who knew her. But Greta herself seemed at peace with her new devotion, and she lived the remaining years of her life. She died in 1908, with a serenity that her earlier life had apparently lacked. These personal stories, taken together, paint a complex picture of the backwards clock's impact. It wasn't simply a scientific curiosity or a philosophical puzzle. For those who experienced its effects directly, it was a profound and sometimes transformative encounter with something beyond normal experience. Some were healed by it, finding liberation from psychological patterns that had trapped them. Others were disturbed or frightened by it, encountering aspects of existence they weren't prepared to face. Still others found it spiritually meaningful, a glimpse of realities beyond the material. What's striking is that the same device produced such varied effects. This suggests that what the clock revealed or induced depended at least partly on who was experiencing it, on their psychological state, their expectations, their readiness to encounter temporal strangeness. In this way, the backwards clock was like a mirror. It reflected something about the people who looked into it, showing them aspects of themselves or of reality that were always there, but normally hidden. And like any powerful mirror, it could be either enlightening or disturbing, depending on what it revealed. These stories remind us that behind every scientific or philosophical discussion, there are human beings having experiences, living lives that are shaped by encounters with mystery. The backwards clock wasn't just an idea to be debated in coffee houses. It was a reality that changed people for better or worse, in ways that rippled out through their relationships and through the remainder of their lives. Part 7. The Clock's Journey. The physical object itself, the backwards clock, had its own story separate from the ideas and debates it inspired. This clock, this arrangement of metal and glass and crystal, moved through Vienna like a silent protagonist in the drama of 1902, touching lives, causing reactions, creating ripples of consequence wherever it went. We've already traced the clock's origins in Hartmann's workshop and its early use in Freud's consulting room and Braun's laboratory. But the clock's journey was more extensive than these official experiments suggest. At various points during 1902 and 1903, the clock moved through different spaces and communities, accumulating its own history. In late May 1902, after Freud had concluded his experiments and returned the clock to Hartmann, the clockmaker faced a decision. The attention the clock had attracted was becoming burdensome. Visitors came to his shop daily, asking to see it, to experience its effects. Some offered substantial sums of money to purchase it. Others simply wanted to understand how it worked. Hartmann, recall, was a private man who had never sought fame. The backwards clock had brought him more attention in a few months than he'd received in 40 years of clockmaking. He found it exhausting and disturbing. He considered destroying the clock. It would be simple enough. A few swings of a hammer and the intricate mechanism would be reduced to broken parts. The mystery would die with the device, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. This was his masterwork, the culmination of decades of skill and intuition. To destroy it would feel like destroying a part of himself. Instead, he made a different decision. He would loan the clock to trusted individuals and institutions for limited periods, under strict conditions. They could study it, document it, but they must return it, and they must not attempt to disassemble or duplicate it. The first recipient of this loan was the physics department at the University of Vienna. Dr. Braun and his colleagues were overjoyed. They had wanted to conduct more extensive experiments, and now they would have the opportunity. The clock spent June and July 1902 in a locked laboratory at the university. During this period, the physicists conducted their most systematic observations. They measured the temporal distortion field with every instrument available. They photographed the clock from every angle. They invited colleagues from other universities to witness demonstrations. One physicist, a visiting professor from Berlin named Wilhelm Weber, proposed a bold experiment. He wanted to place a carefully calibrated chronometer inside the backwards clock sphere of influence and observe whether the chronometer's timekeeping was affected. The experiment was conducted in early July. The chronometer, an extremely precise timepiece used for navigation, was placed on a table next to the backwards clock. Hartmann, who had agreed to be present for major experiments, wound the backwards clock and set it running. The results were ambiguous. The chronometer's mechanism did seem to hesitate during the backwards clock's operation, but only for a fraction of a second. When compared with the reference chronometer kept outside the sphere of influence, The test chronometer was off by approximately 0.3 seconds after the experiment. This suggested that the backwards clock was indeed affecting time itself, not just perception. But the effect was so small that it could also have been experimental error or normal variation in the chronometer's mechanism. The physicists wrote up their findings for publication in a scientific journal. But when they submitted the paper, it was rejected. The reviewers found the results too extraordinary and the methodology too questionable. Without being able to replicate the experiment, which they couldn't do without access to the backwards clock, other scientists were unwilling to accept the claims. This rejection disappointed Braun and his colleagues, but also spared them from controversy. The scientific community in 1902 wasn't ready for claims about devices that could manipulate time. Such claims would have been career-ending. After the university finished its studies, the clock returned to Hartmann's shop for several weeks. During this period, something interesting happened. Artists began requesting access to the clock, not for scientific study, but as inspiration for creative work. Gustav Klimt, the most famous painter in Vienna, heard about the clock through his connections in the cafe scene. He was in the middle of his golden phase, creating the ornate, symbolist works that would make him immortal. Klimt was fascinated by themes of time, mortality, and transformation, and he wanted to experience the backward clock for himself. Hartmann was initially reluctant. An artist was not a scientist, who knew what strange ideas might result. But Klimt was persistent and charming, and eventually Hartmann agreed to a single viewing. Klimt came to the shop on an evening in early September. Hartmann wound the clock, and Klimt sat in silence, watching and experiencing. When the clock stopped, Klimt remained motionless for several minutes, lost in thought. "Thank you," he finally said. "I have seen something that will change my work." Whether the backwards clock directly influenced Klimt's subsequent paintings is impossible to say. But art historians have noted that his paintings from late 1902 onward show an intensified interest in temporal themes. The famous Three Ages of Woman, painted in 1905, depicts childhood, maturity, and old age in a single frame, as if time has been compressed or made simultaneous. This could be coincidence, or it could reflect Klimt's encounter with a device that made temporal simultaneity tangible. Other artists heard about Klimt's visit and wanted their own experiences. The composer Arnold Schoenberg, who he met briefly in the cafe debates, requested and received a visit. Schoenberg was on the cusp of abandoning traditional tonality in music, moving toward the atonal compositions that would revolutionize 20th century music. After experiencing the backwards clock, Schoenberg told friends that he had understood something new about musical time. Music, he realized, doesn't have to progress from beginning to end in a simple linear fashion. It can fold back on itself, create loops and echoes and temporal complexities that reflect the non-linear nature of actual experience. His subsequent compositions, particularly the String Quartet No. 2, composed in 1907 to 1908, show this influence. The music moves in ways that seem to defy temporal logic, creating a sense of time that is fluid and multiple rather than fixed and singular. By October 1902, the backwards clock had become something of a pilgrimage site for Vienna's artistic and intellectual elite. Hartmann found himself hosting a procession of poets, philosophers, musicians, and writers, all wanting their moment with a mysterious device. Some of these visitors left written accounts of their experiences. The writer Hugo von Hofmannsthal described the clock as a window into the eternal present, where all moments exist simultaneously, undivided by the artificial construct of chronological sequence. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke, visiting Vienna in late 1902, experienced the clock and wrote, I saw time as it truly is, not a line but a sphere containing all moments at once, and I understood that past and future are illusions, that only the eternal now is real. These poetic responses frustrated the scientists, who saw them as romantic mystification of what was essentially a physical phenomenon. But the artists argued that poetry and metaphor could capture truths that scientific language missed, that their subjective experiences of the clock were as valid as any objective measurements. This tension between scientific and artistic interpretations of the clock continued throughout its public life. The scientists wanted to understand how it worked, to fit it into a theoretical framework. The artists wanted to experience what it revealed, to let it transform their understanding without necessarily explaining it. In November 1902, disaster nearly struck. A fire broke out in the building that housed Hartmann's shop. The cause was never determined. Perhaps a lamp knocked over in a neighboring apartment, perhaps faulty wiring in the old building's walls. But flames spread quickly through the dry wood and plaster. Hartmann was in his workshop when he smelled smoke. He immediately grabbed the backwards clock and his most valuable tools and fled into the street. The fire brigade arrived quickly and managed to contain the blaze before it destroyed the entire building. But Hartmann's shop was severely damaged, and many of his clocks and instruments were destroyed. The backwards clock, however, was saved. Hartmann stood in the street, clutching it, as he watched smoke pour from his workshop windows. He realized in that moment just how much the clock had come mean to him, not just as his masterwork, but as something more, a connection to mysteries he could barely articulate. The fire forced Hartmann to close his shop for repairs. During this period, the backwards clock stayed in his apartment, wrapped carefully and placed in a corner. For several months, it was quiet and unseen, removed from the public eye that had been focused on it for so long. When the shop finally reopened in February 1903, Hartmann made a decision. He would no longer loan out the backwards clock. The stream of visitors, the experiments, the attention, it had all become too much. The clock would remain in his private workshop, seen only by him. This decision was met with disappointment and frustration from those who had been planning to study or experience the clock. Dr. Braun protested that further scientific investigation was needed. Artists complained that they were being denied access to an important source of inspiration. But Hartmann was firm. The clock was his creation, his property, and he had the right to withdraw it from public view. And so he did. For the next several years, the backwards clock existed only in memory and legend. Those who had experienced it told their stories, but no new experiences were possible. The clock became mythologized, its effects perhaps exaggerated in the retelling, its significance magnified by its inaccessibility. There are rumors that Hartmann occasionally wounded the clock in private during these years, that he continued to experience its effects alone in his workshop late at night. But if so, he told no one about these private encounters. He had returned to the solitude that had characterized his life before the backwards clock had made him briefly famous. The clock's last known public appearance was in 1906 at a small private gathering of Vienna's scientific community. Hartmann, now elderly and in declining health, was honored for his contributions to horology. As part of the ceremony, he brought the backwards clock and demonstrated it one final time. Those present described it as a poignant moment. The old clockmaker wound the mechanism with trembling hands. The clock ticked backward for perhaps 20 seconds, creating its familiar sphere of temporal distortion. And then it stopped, and Hartmann carefully wrapped it and took it home. After that night, the backwards clock vanished from history. What happened to it is one of the great mysteries of this story, and we'll explore the various theories in our final chapter. But before we reach that ending, there's one more aspect of the clock's influence we need to examine: its broader cultural impact and the legacy it left behind. Part 8. The Disappearance and the Legacy. Johann Hartmann died in December 1909 at the age of 67. His death was quiet, expected. He had been in declining health for several years. The obituary in the Neue Freie Presse mentioned his work as a clockmaker, noting that he had operated a shop in the Innere for over 40 years. It made no mention of the backwards clock. When Hartmann's workshop was cleared out after his death, the backwards clock was not among his possessions. His few remaining clocks and tools were inventoried and sold. The shop itself was taken over by another craftsman. But the famous backwards clock had disappeared. Where did it go? This question has fascinated researchers and amateur historians for over a century, spawning various theories and occasional claims of discovery. The most prosaic explanation is that Hartmann destroyed the clock himself before his death. He had always been ambivalent about his creation, and as his health failed, he may have decided that the clock was too dangerous or too mysterious to leave behind. Perhaps, on some cold winter evening, he took it apart piece by piece, separating the mechanism into components that would reveal nothing of how they had worked together, and disposed of them where they would never be found. This theory is plausible, but it leaves many unsatisfied. Would a craftsman destroy his masterwork? And if he did, wouldn't someone have noticed or remembered? A second theory suggests that the clock was stolen during the years after Hartmann's death. His workshop stood empty for several months before being cleaned out, and several people knew about the backwards clock's existence and approximate location. Perhaps someone broke in and took it, hoping to study it or sell it. If this happened, the clock left no trace. No one ever came forward claiming to have it, and it never appeared in antique markets or private collections. If it was stolen, the thief either hid it well or destroyed it after realizing they couldn't replicate its effects. A more intriguing theory involves the Austrian government. By 1909, Europe was moving toward the catastrophe of World War I. Military technology was advancing rapidly, and governments were interested in any scientific development that might provide strategic advantage. Could temporal manipulation be weaponized? Could the backwards clock's principles be applied to military purposes? We don't know, but it's not impossible that some intelligence agency learned about the clock and confiscated it for study. This would explain both its disappearance and the lack of any public record of what happened to it. Some researchers have pointed to fragmentary evidence that Austrian military scientists conducted experiments with unusual technologies in the years before World War I. But nothing concrete connects these experiments to Hartmann's clock. Perhaps the most romantic theory is that the clock still exists somewhere, forgotten in an attic or storeroom, waiting to be rediscovered. Occasionally, someone claims to have found it. An antique dealer will produce an old clock with a reverse-running mechanism, or a private collector will announce they've acquired a device with mysterious properties. But none of these claims have withstood scrutiny. The backwards clock, if it still exists, has remained successfully hidden for over a century. What's more certain than the clock's physical fate is its intellectual and cultural legacy. The backwards clock, during its brief period of public visibility, had left an indelible mark on Viennese intellectual life. For physicists, it raised questions about the nature of time. They're still being explored today. Can time be manipulated locally? Are there configurations of matter that can affect temporal flow? These questions, which seemed outlandish in 1902, are now subjects of serious theoretical physics. Einstein's relativity showed that time is relative and flexible. Modern quantum mechanics has revealed even stranger aspects of temporal behavior. Hartmann's clock, in some sense, anticipated these discoveries. For psychologists, particularly those influenced by Freud, The clock demonstrated something about the relationship between consciousness and time. The unconscious mind, Freud had argued, operates outside of normal time. The backwards clock seemed to create a bridge between conscious and unconscious temporal experience. This idea influenced the development of psychoanalysis and continues to resonate in modern cognitive science's attempts to understand how the brain constructs our sense of time. For artists and writers, the backwards clock became a powerful symbol. It represented the possibility of breaking free from linear chronology, of imagining and depicting time in more complex and interesting ways. The modernist literature that flourished in the early 20th century, James Joyce's stream of consciousness, Marcel Proust's involuntary memories, Virginia Woolf's fluid temporality, all reflect a concern with nonlinear time that was very much in the air in 1902, partly because of discussions surrounding Hartmann's clock. The clock also left a legacy in popular culture and imagination. Stories about time travel and temporal manipulation became increasingly common in the early 20th century, and while H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, 1895, predated Hartmann's clock, the renewed interest in such themes after 1902 may have been partly inspired by reports of the backwards clock. Vienna itself underwent a temporal reversal of sorts in the years after the clock's disappearance. The empire that had seemed eternal in 1902 collapsed in 1918. The grand palaces and coffeehouses remained, but the world they represented was gone. Those who had debated the backwards clock in the Café Central in 1902 found themselves, by 1918, living in a fundamentally different world, as if time had indeed run backward and erased everything they had known. Many of the intellectuals who had encountered the backwards clock didn't survive the transition. Some died in World War I. Others were forced to flee as Europe descended into fascism. Freud himself, elderly and ill, had to leave Vienna in 1938 to escape Nazi persecution. He died in London in 1939, just as another war was beginning. But Freud took with him memories of the backwards clock, and those memories influenced his final theoretical work. In his last major book, Moses and Monotheism, 1939, Freud wrote about how traumatic historical events can be repressed and then return, how the past is never truly past, but continues to influence the present in disguised forms. Some scholars have suggested that his experience with Hartmann's clock, the device which literally brought the past into the present, shaped these final thoughts about temporal psychology. The clock also left traces in unexpected places. In 1927, Jorge Luis Borges visited Vienna. The young Argentine writer was already fascinated with time, infinity, and the labyrinthine nature of reality, themes that would dominate his mature work. While in Vienna, he heard stories about the backwards clock from elderly intellectuals who remembered its brief period of fame. Borges never wrote directly about the backwards clock, but it may have influenced his story The Secret Miracle, about a man who experiences time stopping during his execution, or The Garden of Forking Paths, about a novel that contains all possible futures simultaneously. Borges' characteristic concern with temporal paradoxes and the multiplicity of time resonates with the questions the backwards clock had raised. In more recent years, the clock has occasionally resurfaced in cultural memory. A 1970s science fiction novel referenced it. A contemporary artist created an installation inspired by it. Occasionally, articles appear in Austrian newspapers around the anniversary of Hartmann's death, speculating about what happened to his famous creation. And sometimes, very rarely, someone comes forward claiming to have experienced something like what the backwards clock produced. These reports are always ambiguous, impossible to verify, but they keep alive the idea that temporal anomalies might be possible, that the orderly progression from past to future that we take for granted might occasionally break down, revealing something stranger beneath. From a scientific perspective, modern physics has made Hartmann's clock seem less impossible than it once appeared. We now know that time is not absolute, that it can be dilated by velocity or gravity, that at the quantum scale, time behaves in very strange ways. The idea of a device creating a localized region where time behaves differently doesn't violate any fundamental principles of physics, even if we don't know how such a device could actually be built. Some physicists have speculated that Hartmann might have accidentally created a kind of temporal wave interference pattern, similar to how acoustic waves can create standing patterns of sound. If the right combination of materials and mechanisms could create interfering waves in space-time itself, they might produce the kinds of effects Hartmann observed. This remains speculation. Without the actual clock to study, without Hartmann's detailed notes and specifications, we can't reconstruct what he did. We're left with descriptions of effects, but no explanation of causes, which is frustrating for science, but perhaps appropriate for mystery. And perhaps that's the right note on which to end this part of the story. The backwards clock, whether it still exists somewhere or was destroyed long ago, remains mysterious. We have reliable accounts of what it did, but we don't fully understand how it did it. We know it affected people in profound ways, but we can't entirely explain those effects. In a sense, the clock exists now more as idea than as object. It lives in the stories told about it, in the questions it raised, in the influence it had on those who encountered it. And ideas, unlike physical objects, can't be destroyed or lost. They persist through time, forward and backward, echoing through the years, touching minds that come after, creating ripples that spread outward into the future. The backwards clock is gone, but its legacy remains, ticking quietly in the background of our understanding of time, consciousness, and possibility. And perhaps that's a more fitting fate than languishing forgotten in a museum somewhere. Mystery, after all, has its own kind of immortality. As Vienna moved through the 20th century, surviving 2 world wars, adapting to new technologies and social orders, the memory of the backwards clock remained part of the city's mythology. Old-timers would sometimes speak of it in cafes. Younger generations would dismiss it as legend or exaggeration. But the questions it raised never quite disappeared. And on certain quiet nights, in certain old buildings in the Innenstadt, people walking past might hear a sound like a clock ticking. But whether it's ticking forward or backward, no one can quite say. Conclusion: reflections on time and mystery. As we come to the end of our journey through the story of the backwards clock, let's pause for a moment and consider what this tale tells us about time, about mystery, about the nature of reality itself. The backwards clock existed, of that we could be reasonably certain. Too many credible witnesses saw it and experienced its effects for it to be dismissed as pure fiction. Johann Hartmann created something remarkable in his workshop in Vienna in 1902, something that challenged and confused everyone who encountered it. But what did it actually do? That question remains open. Did it genuinely affect the flow of time, creating a localized region where temporal rules were different? Or did it affect only consciousness, changing how observers perceived and experienced time, without actually altering time itself? Perhaps this distinction doesn't matter as much as we might think. If time as we experience it is inseparable from consciousness, then changing consciousness changes time in the only sense that matters to us as conscious beings. The backwards clock, whatever its mechanism, revealed something profound about the relationship between mind and time, between subjective experience and objective reality. What's most striking about the backwards clock story is how it captured the imagination of an entire culture. For a few months in 1902, Vienna was collectively thinking about time, questioning assumptions, exploring possibilities. The clock became a catalyst for intellectual and artistic exploration that rippled out far beyond the device itself. This speaks to something important about how cultural change happens. New ideas don't emerge in isolation. They require contexts, moments when people are ready to question what they thought they knew, when the ground has been prepared for radical rethinking. Vienna in 1902 was such a moment, and the backwards clock arrived at exactly the right time to spark transformation. The story also reminds us of how much knowledge can be lost. Hartmann created something extraordinary, but he couldn't or wouldn't document it in a way that would allow others to replicate it. When he died, that knowledge died with him. How many other discoveries have been lost this way? How many insights into nature's workings have flickered briefly into existence and then vanished, leaving only traces in historical records? This is why mystery persists. Not just because the universe is mysterious in itself, but because human knowledge is fragile, incomplete, constantly being forgotten and rediscovered. We like to think of knowledge as cumulative, always building on what came before. But the backwards clock reminds us that knowledge can also be lost, that there may have been things that people in the past understood that we've forgotten. At the same time, the backwards clock story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of mystery. The people who experienced the clock were profoundly affected, sometimes in positive ways, sometimes in disturbing ones. Some found healing and insight. Others found existential dread or psychological destabilization. Mystery is powerful, and power can be dangerous. Hartmann understood this, which is why he eventually withdrew the clock from public view. He recognized that what he had created was not just interesting, but potentially harmful, that not everyone was ready for the kind of temporal and psychological disruption the clock produced. This raises questions about how we approach mystery in our own lives. Do we seek it out, embrace it, let it transform us? Or do we keep it at arm's length, protecting ourselves from its potentially unsettling effects? There's no single right answer. Different people need different relationships with mystery, depending on their circumstances and psychological makeup. What we can say is that mystery, when encountered thoughtfully and with appropriate care, can be enriching. It can open our minds to possibilities we hadn't considered, can shake us free from rigid patterns of thinking, can remind us that reality is larger and stranger than our theories about it. The backwards clock, for all its strangeness, ultimately pointed towards something profoundly human. It showed that time is not just a physical phenomenon, but an experiential one, that how we remember the past and imagine the future shapes who we are in the present. It revealed that consciousness and time are intimately connected, that the flow of moments through which we live our lives is more complex and more malleable than we usually recognize. These insights remain relevant today. We live in an age of constant acceleration, where technology has changed our relationship with time in fundamental ways. We can communicate instantaneously across the globe. We can access information from any moment in human history with a few keystrokes. We can create virtual experiences that manipulate our sense of temporal flow. In some ways, modern technology is making us all live a bit like we're inside the backwards clock sphere of influence. The clear distinctions between past, present, and future are blurring. Memory becomes confused with documentation. The present moment is constantly interrupted by reminders of past events and notifications about future ones. Understanding this, understanding how consciousness and time interact, how the temporal structure of experience shapes who we are, these remain important questions. The backwards clock, that mysterious device from 1902, was perhaps trying to teach us something about these questions that we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. So what should we take away from this story as we prepare for sleep? Perhaps simply this: time is mysterious. Consciousness is mysterious. The relationship between them is mysterious. And mystery, encountered with curiosity and humility, can enrich our lives rather than threatening them. The backwards clock is gone, but the questions it raised remain. They tick onward through the years, forward and backward, inviting each new generation to wonder, to question, to explore the boundaries of what's possible. As you drift off to sleep tonight, you might find yourself thinking about time, about how strange it is that we experience moments as flowing from past to future, when physics tells us the underlying laws work just as well in reverse. About how your memories of the past and your imagination of the future exist in the eternal now of consciousness. About how this very moment, this transition into sleep, is a kind of temporal boundary crossing, where the normal rules of sequential time break down and dreams take you into realms where past and future merge. Perhaps, in that liminal state between waking and sleeping, you'll catch a glimpse of what Hartmann's backwards clock revealed. That time is more fluid, more flexible, more mysterious than we usually acknowledge. And perhaps that glimpse will stay with you, coloring your experience, making you more aware of the extraordinary strangeness of this thing we call time, through which we all travel, forward and backward, sleeping and waking, living and remembering. Sweet dreams, travelers through time. May your journey through the night be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed, ready to face the forward flow of time with a renewed appreciation for its mysteries. Before we part ways tonight, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into the past, into the mystery of the backwards clock and the Vienna that gave it birth. These stories matter, not because they provide easy answers, but because they remind us that reality is stranger and more wonderful than we usually remember. If you enjoyed this exploration of time and mystery, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something beautifully ironic about the fact that this story about a clock that counted backwards is being heard at different times around the world, that what is evening for some of you is morning for others. That time itself is relative to where we stand on our spinning planet. And if there are other mysteries you'd like me to explore, other stories from history or legend that intrigue you, please share them. Every comment, every suggestion helps shape the future of Mystic Sleep Tales. You're not just listeners. You're part of a community of curious souls seeking wonder in the darkness, finding comfort in mystery, using these stories as gateways to peaceful sleep and vivid dreams. So please, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale. And most importantly, share your thoughts, your experiences, your own encounters with mystery. What stories keep you wondering late at night? What questions about reality intrigue you? What historical enigmas would you like to explore together? Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, time is stranger than you think, and the clock is always ticking, forward or backward, marking the moments of your mysterious, precious life. Good night, dear travelers. May your dreams be filled with wonder, and may you wake refreshed, carrying with you just a hint of the backwards clock's temporal magic.